Hello, welcome at the second day of our Congress. Today we start with the presentation of Yong and Florin Nechita. Yong is from University in Brunei and he teaches media production and filmmaking, and everyone already know Florin. Florin is from Transilvania University of Braşov, and he specializes in marketing and promotion, and he has a PhD in marketing. So I believe it's enough short introduction this time because we are running out of time. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And the official Palinka provider, yes? Okay, so our presentation is related with something that happened mainly last year. So was a cooperation between Romanian and Bruneian students. But first, let's set the frame of the topic that we'll talk less, and at the end we'll have a short movie. So project-based learning, it's teaching by assigning students or giving students real-life projects that they can solve. And by solving these problems, it's said to be that they learn more than in the traditional way of teaching. This project, as I already told you, that implies or involved Romanian and Bruneian students here in Brașov last year. And of course, the results are in a way by enhancing quality and also experiences of these teams of students making movies. Now, regarding the project, it's about the Dracula digital competition. So it's a competition for short movies filmed, edited with a smartphone. And this competition aimed to, in a way, also to create or to make some education in the area of filming among young people between 16 and 30 years old. It started in 2016. Actually, now we are in the 8th edition of Dracula Digital. Dracula Digital being a project into a project. So Dracula Digital was launched 4 years after the start of the Dracula Film Festival. Dracula Film Festival being this year at the 11th edition. And as you know already, that it's a film festival focusing on horror, fantasy, and science fiction genres movies. And the first cooperation between my faculty of Sociology and Communication from Transilvania University in Brașov, started in 2018. So actually from the 3rd edition, when together with the organizers and also the director of or the initiator of this project, a friend of mine, we agreed that for a team of students from the digital media program was the newest program in portfolio provided of programs provided by my faculty. And then the first cohort started in 2018. Basically, we get the wild card, so a direct access to the final for a team of students that are from the first year in digital media. Normally, they start the selection of the movies made by these teams of 3 young people at the end of June, and they should send their proposal until the beginning of September. Then a jury will make a selection, and 6 movies goes to the final. Another 7th is based on the vote of the publics, and starting from 2018, one and then 2 teams from Transilvania University from the digital media program get this wildcard. Starting from 2019, we shared these 2 wildcards, one for our student and one for partner university. So students that are coming from a partner university with Transilvania University of Brașov. If want to stay, let's say, more academic and with theory, project-based learning, it's can be framed in the different authors like Fink, so talking about or writing about taxonomy of significant learning. Also, it's coming from even earlier from the John Dewey, that he was a promoter of this style of education based on the real problem, because project-based learning enhance critical thinking, also direct the students to the problem solving, make them to find different creative ways of solving the problems, and in this way let's say train their practical skills. And of course, especially in the teams where are people from different cultural background, they increase, let's say, some kind of fast forward in the learning intercultural communication. I organize also some summer school and other this kind of project, and all the time the most important task for me is how to make the teams. So in order to not to be as heterogeneous as it can, so to not have from the same nationality if it's possible in the same team, and all the time this is the first task. Now I will pass the microphone to Yong, my colleague, that now it's already here in Brașov for the 4th time, or?
It's my first time.
Oh, okay, so a veteran.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Florin, for this introduction. So we probably, I think I spent a little bit more time before this, so I just, cut it short as much as possible, just to add up a little bit from the Brunei perspective. Yeah. So UBD, maybe you probably know Brunei is a very tiny country located in Southeast Asia. For my knowledge, only few was there 20 years ago, right? So that's a very tiny country circulated by Malaysia. That's the location. So we first time involved into this Dracula Digital was in 2020, benefiting from Florin just mentioned their wild card for the final competition. They share one of the wild card with partner university. So we are lucky to get a wild card for one of the teams, but in 2020, that's in the middle of the pandemic, so Brunei was locked down at that time, so we couldn't do anything. Fly. I think most of the people in the world cannot do the travel, right? So we decided to form up 2 teams to compete locally from Brunei. So luckily, one of the team actually got the wild card from Florin. They won the Dracula Digital Trophy. It's a surprise.
Yes,
yeah.
It was the first team
Yeah.
among all the 9 teams that competed.
Yeah. Because Brunei is too small, that actually becomes a national news inside the Brunei. All the national papers, national broadcasters, have the news coverage about this competition win. So that actually encouraged us to continue this competition. But unfortunately, the next year, 2021, from August to December, that was Brunei's second lockdown. So I end up we cannot do nothing at that time. The students just a bit scared about going out to shoot even. So we just gave up that opportunity. So then when we got to 2022, so most of the world get into back to normal. I think it's a new norm, right? Brunei did the same. So we happen to have a new dean. The dean want to promote the everything back to normal, to to get everybody cheer up. So we decided, so she decided the faculty will sponsor one team of 3 to come to Braşov to compete here. So that is all the things happening, like Florin just mentioned. 3 Brunei UBD students came here, and they team up with 3 student peers from University of Transilvania, Brașov, and they compete the final Dracula digital final competition. They actually worked very well. They cooperated very well. Although they didn't win the competition, they earned something much more valuable than winning the trophy and the €500 cash prize. Although if winning would be better, right? But only one winner for each competition, right? But I'm happy they learned something, for their future career and maybe their lifetime. So I think that's something more valuable. So the documentary we would like to share with you is just based on this event. So I probably don't need to say much. We can just
only just to add that I launched this pre-selection for the wildcard among our students from digital media from the first year, and we get, I think, 4 proposals in that year, last year, and first team competed together with the other finalists. And for the second team, because I saw that they were so dedicated and eager to be in the final, I was thinking, how should I let's say keep them involved? So I proposed them to be like to team up, join the Bruneian students. So to be in a way involved in this competition by being actors in the. So Bruneian students come with all the thinking about this, what they should make, because I forgot to mention, Dracula digital competition starts on Wednesday evening, so in the first day of the Dracula Film Festival, and the teams receive some keywords. And for example, last year, you remember?
Only number of.
And you remember how difficult it was to involve cross in the plot, coming from the Islamic country. So you'll see the solution. Very difficult. So okay. So now let's play the
short film.
The short film document. I think it stop sharing and then no. Just going to the film direct.
There we go. Sound.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I really love it, especially that we had a chance to watch the movies last year. I remember them really good, and I believe they were great, especially the one with the haunted library and the one with the psycho killer. I really love them. So we don't have much time. So if I could ask you to keep the discussion shortly. So is there anyone who wants to say something?
Question. It's not the question really, but I just wanted to congratulate on the cooperation first of all, because it's so interesting, and I absolutely love the film to see these young chaps being so happy about the exchange of the cultures in the first place, but also about filmmaking, which is great. So yeah, I love that. And as Nina said, we saw the film last year and they were excellent. So what a fantastic idea, guys. Congratulations.
Okay, are there any more questions, any more comments?
No questions. I'm super impressed. Those kids are absolutely adorable. And it looks like they were having a great time. And I'm really impressed with like how skilled they seem to be already. They seem like a great group. So clearly you guys are doing a great job teaching them.
Yeah, they met each other only 24 hours before. So and then they received the keywords for the plot and just started to work.
That's impressive. That's really impressive.
Also, it's other part of if going to theory of project-based learning. So this time pressure, it's also one of the feature according with some authors, and also the public display of the work. So knowing that the jury will judge their work, or in other cases, for example, organizing exhibition or something like that, add more extra adrenaline in order to get the best of working together. Okay,
that's cool. That's very cool.
Okay, so we are moving to the next presentation, and it's me. So
just give me a moment. We're taking over. It's Nina's turn. And before she's done with the presentation, I'm going to just read you some information about her. Okay, so first of all, we all know Nina already because she's been present with us for ages now, and she also took part in the first in-person conference in Brașov in 2018, wasn't it? So that's how we met Nina. She just appeared out of the blue sky in Brașov in Transylvania, and we just fell in love with her right away, as a person and as a researcher as well, because there was just this little kid at that time, and her presentation was so good. It just blew our minds, and we were all very impressed and continue being so. But let me just read something about professional career of Nina. So Nina works as an academic teacher at the University of that's Florin's probably. Florin? Oh, he's not your phone. Sorry. Yeah. So she's a teacher at the University of Adam Mickiewicz in Poznań in Poland, at University of and University of Warsaw. Okay, I missed that. She's right. So we have to correct the PhD, because when we received it, Nina didn't have her PhD, but good news, and we have to applaud really loud because. 2 weeks ago, she defended her PhD thesis, and she's a PhD now, so she's a doctor now. Congratulations, Nina, by the way. We're all very proud and happy that you found time for us this year as well. We'll have to queue soon for her attention. Right, so yes, so this is the good news, and we're going to say we're planning to celebrate tonight, by the way. So she spoke about Greek vampires on many different conferences, such as a cross-platform Dracula conference. This evolved into Children of the Night, by the way. So that was 2018 in Braşov, and then Children of the Night Congresses last year and the year before as well. Okay, and you have a lot of Greek letters, which I'm completely failing with. Sorry about it. You can have a look at the biography yourself. But she's the author of many articles, and now hopefully the PhD is going to come in print as well. And I believe that today we are going to be listening about your dissertation. Yes, I don't know. Have I missed something really important in your career here? Okay, so over to Nina.
Thank you very much. My presentation is titled Diachronic Approach to Greek Vampirism Based on Literary and Non-Literary Sources, an overview of the PhD dissertation. So the first part of the title of my paper is also the title of my PhD dissertation, the defense of which took place earlier this month. Today, I would like to conclude my research and present to you its final overview. But first thing first, I need to give you some context first. My dissertation is revolving around vampiric beliefs in modern Greece. Considering the main topic, my research could be classified as folklorist. Looking at the methods used and my primary sources, it should be labeled as textual research focused especially on the genre of a folk account. Giving thought to the criterion of time, my research can be characterized as historical, restricted by the publication dates of the first and last text source, so 1645 till 1979. So when we look at the structure, my work is divided into 2 chapters, even though it encompasses 3 work stages. First 2 work stages create the first chapter, and the third work stage becomes the base of the second chapter. The central part of my thesis is the text corpus consisting of 10 text sources, which can be used separately from my research by experts in various fields of knowledge. The titles and authors are visible on my presentation. So during the selection process, I was using the method of collecting and pre-selecting documents. The carefully chosen text sources were then translated into Polish from 4 different languages, namely Latin, French, English, and modern Greek. All sources are provided with philological commentary as well as margin notes, which single out the individual narratives, so-called folk accounts. The aim of the second stage of my research was the examination of context of the selected sources, which helps with their eventual critical analysis. The most important part is the evaluation of credibility of each of the sources, and in order to achieve that, I used the method of analysis and criticism of literature along with the technique of document examination. The tool that I applied is 8-point original formula designed by me. What's important, the stages first and second were executed simultaneously, as the knowledge of the underlying context is essential for the translatory equivalence. The consequence of the previous stages is the possibility to refine raw data from the sources while being aware of their context. Because of that, I could achieve the ultimate goal of my dissertation, which was the creation of an inclusive portrayal of the Greek vampire. This part takes the form of the description, divided into 6 subchapters, each focused on one aspect of Greek vampirism at the time. Here, the method used can be described as the method of analysis and logical construction, the so-called method of the thought experiment, where the reductionist approach can be seen in the abstraction of the aspects of vampirism, and the holistic approach lies in the description as multi-layered but consistent unity. And I believe that this introduction is enough, and I can move on to the conclusions drawn during the research. So let's start with general conclusions that refer to the entirety of the text corpus. Even within the macrostructures of the analyzed folk accounts, some regularities can be observed, such as repetitive plot lines, returning episodes, and recurring motifs. Looking through the prism of functionality, the majority of the examined accounts could be categorized as the text which are of the intention to scare the recipient. A few of the folk accounts feature obscene and ribald humor. Some of the accounts could be also interpreted as moralizing, especially the ones that warn against marriage with strangers. Some of the analyzed material reveal an etiological character which could explain the cause of some natural phenomena such as epidemics and plague. In my opinion, however, the most important function of the accounts is, except of provoking fear, to strengthen the sociocultural norms. Vrikolakes, the Greek vampires, were seen as a common threat which had to be fought collectively with the help of traditional measures. The applied diachronic approach allowed to show the changes occurring in the discourse. The very first sources written by the authors specialized in theology were not really focused on the exposition of the folk narratives, but they were centered around authors' interpretation and explanation of the described vampiric phenomena, so they could fit into church rhetoric. Over time, the ontological and cosmological disputes of clergymen were overshadowed by the travelogues written by the travelers fascinated with the folk demonology. The travel literature tries to seduce the reader with the erudite storytelling, exotic descriptions, and macabre tales. This attitude gradually evolved towards ethnographic research, recording not only folk beliefs, but also elements of folk culture, such as specific language or even pronunciation. This means that the most recent sources are almost reduced to the anthologies of recorded folk accounts without any further elaboration. As we can see, in the first sources, the attention was focused primarily on expert stance. The folk tales were used only as the illustration to the commentary of the church official. At some point, however, the roles of expert and informant were equalized so that the commentary of the expert was still relevant and their stance was appropriately exposed, but at the same time, accounts of the informants were not pushed aside to the background. At that time, the hermeneutics guided by the ecclesiastical rhetoric has gradually faded away, and the discourse began to branch out in different directions, such as cultural anthropology or ethnography. The most recent sources seem to lose the researcher's perspective as their objective becomes to an exposure of the narrator. They record informant's name, age, place of origin, dialect, and even idiolect. So let me now move on to the detailed conclusions regarding the researched aspects, starting with the terminology. In modern Greek demonology, vampires were called by many different names, which sometimes were used interchangeably. The analysis of the sources allowed me to distinguish 19 different terms as the presentation shows. The most basic term is vrikolakas, and we should keep in mind that nowadays this word expanded its semantic field and denotes not only vampires in the strict folkloric sense, but also vampires from pop culture. There has been an ongoing debate for years whether the term vrikolakas is of a Greek origin or perhaps it is rather a linguistic loan. Nowadays, most of the experts lean towards the second theory, but we still lack an unmistakable proof. Moving on to the other terms, it is determined that the words such as katahanas, vampiras, anekafumenos, sarkomenos, dusmanis are regional names. Some of the words such as tympaneos, alitos, katachtonios, and dupi are used only in theological contexts and do not belong to the laic speech. However, there are also some terms with religious subtext like pirasmos and diaolos, and they are used in colloquial speech. Some of the names are used as a sort of collectivum, a broader umbrella term, for example, demonas, exotiko, possibly also stichiomenos, and kakantropisma. Interestingly, there are some words that usually describe demonic creatures other than vampires, but due to semantic shifts, they locally are used to denominate a vampire. Kalikanzaros, stichio, diaolos, telonio, phantasma. Some of the terms like zorzolakas, nomolakas, and perhaps vampiras are used only by Eastern European travelers, and I couldn't find them in any of the Greek sources, which could potentially mean that they were recorded wrongly due to some kind of error. As it comes to etymology of the names, sometimes it is obvious at the first glance, and we have some words that remain an enigma. Last but not least, there is a group of terms which are obviously an adaptation of foreign nomenclature like vampiras, vampir, Nosferatu, and Draculas. It is important to stress that the international word vampire, vampir, did not replace the term vrikolakas, and it is used extremely rarely, mainly in academia, in order to differentiate between the concept of Greek vrikolakas and an idea of Eastern vampire. I believe it is time to move on to the ontology aspects. First, I need to stress that there is not enough data in the sources regarding the nature of the vrikolakas, mainly because it was the subject that mostly concerned the clergy and is almost entirely absent in the proper folk tales. It means that in diachronic perspective, only the earliest texts are debating this issue and the later do not continue the topic. As the literature evidences, the theological texts very often try to apply the pseudoscience of humoral pathology in order to explain undecayed corpses found during an exhumation process. The proper vampiric phenomenon, walking corpse, was supposed to be caused by the activity of the devil, wherein the insufficient faith of the local population was supposed to be a favorable condition for diabolical deeds. It was told that the devil had the power to send the dreams and visions upon people. However, it is said that Satan could possess the corpse as well and animate it, or he could make the exact replica of the body from any material. One of the examined authors, Leo Alatios, tried to push the concept of the vampire with the soul trapped inside of the corpse, which was, according to him, an orthodox version of Catholic purgatory. To achieve that, he used a belief sanctioned by the Orthodox Church that the priest has the power to bind the soul to the body, which creates an undecayed corpse as a result. Nowadays, we know that the Greek canonical law distinguished this kind of revenant called tympaneos from the vrikolakas, so it is visible that the fusion of those two creatures was a deliberate or not abuse of the term. The tympaneos in Orthodox tradition was a passive, undecayed corpse with the soul trapped inside by a priest. Meanwhile, the vrikolakas was the like term used to denote an aggressive corpse animated by the devil. By combining these two different creatures, Alatios attempted to reconcile the two branches of Christianity. With the agenda of Alatios comes into the dispute theory of Jesuit Father Francois Richard. He firmly states that the Orthodox people do not believe in purgatory and therefore they cannot enter that domain. In his work, Richard discusses also the possibility that the Orthodox vampirism is a divine punishment or maybe a gratification. And the second argument was used quite often in Eastern Church propaganda to show the power of Greek clergy. As I have stated before, the purely laic understanding of vampirism was never recorded in my sources, but some excerpts from nomocanons, as well as some later folk tales, give us the subtle hint that people might believe that the vrikolakas was basically a dead man that rose from a grave sui generis, possibly with their own soul. We have also less common means of explaining the vampiric phenomenon. For example, free sources rationalize the vampiric stories by showing them as a tool of some vicious men who try to take advantage of the naivety of superstitious people. And moreover, Dorothy Demetrakopoulou quotes a peculiar story in which a vrikolakas is some kind of demonic being that can transfer itself from animals onto dead people. The topic of ontology is very unclear in most of the sources, so let's continue to more obvious part of my research. So, becoming vrikolakas. From my source material, I have listed 14 immediate causes of vampirization, and they are visible on my presentation. The causes were examined separately. However, during that process, I discovered that they partially overlap. For example, bad death is usually linked to improper performance of funeral rites, sinful life, dying far away from home, and over-attachment to occupation. The result of failed funeral rites is usually the draskilo. The act of excommunication is very similar to the act of damnation. Conversion to Islam was considered then a sin, so it is associated with leading a sinful life, and so on. Moreover, I conducted a quantitative research to determine the frequency of each of the above-mentioned causes, and the chart pi is visible at the presentation. Furthermore, I have compared my list of causes with similar enumeration prepared by other researchers, namely John Cadbert-Lawson and Bob Curran. Going to the aspect of the appearance, let's start with the notion that Vrikolakies can be of both sexes. However, the male vampires are more common in the folk accounts. The reasons can be attributed to the patriarchal structures of Greek society. Usually, the role of a woman was much more restricted, so male characters capable of acting on their own volition generally fit into more tropes featured in vampire folk stories. Unfortunately, it is not possible to estimate the absolute percentage proportion between male and female vampires, mostly because of gender-neutral language used in some stories. Generally speaking, the description of vampires from the source material can be divided into two categories, which should be not treated identically. In my opinion, the description of passive vampires are most likely records of actual observation, while the descriptions of active vampires are irrational figments of the imagination or misinterpretation of physical phenomena. In the first case, the source material emphasizes deviations from the norm in the appearance of the corpses, which were interpreted as manifestation of vampirism. The most important characteristic feature was the light decomposition of a body, which was supposed to be a proof that the devil or soul is preserving the corpse. The signs of vitality were also observed, including liquid blood in the veins, change in the position of the body in the coffin, lack of rigor mortis, warmth, fumes coming inside of the body after it was cut open, and presence of hair, nails, and teeth. Moreover, some of the exhumed bodies were increasing their volume in the grave and changing their color. The second type of Vrikolakies, the active ones, were presented in the folk accounts as characters that can act of their own volition. In contrast to the dead vampires, the undead vampires do not have a coherent constant image. However, it is possible to distill certain tendencies in their descriptions. The most common form is an anthropomorphic one, usually reflecting the appearance of the Vrikolakas during their life, although there were some exceptions to this rule. The focus stays rather on negative than positive features, which may result in occasional hybrid representation, anthropomorphic forms with zoomorphic or teratological features. Descriptions of fully teratological characters appear more often than hybrids, and recurring images include a vampire goat skin, so-called tulumi, a vampire with one side open, a skeleton vampire, and a devil vampire. It was quite common to believe that a vampire could turn into an animal because of their shape-shifting abilities. Here, the dog vampires predominate, especially when it comes to vampires of Turkish origin. Vampires quite often take on amorphous forms, usually appearing as voices, or light forms, will-o'-the-wisps. Lastly, it should be emphasized that descriptions of dead bodies are usually do not contain fantastic features, as they fall within the limits allowed by physiology and pathology, while the description of active vampires are less motivated in terms of rationality. The next aspect is a little more complicated. While researching the vampire doings, I used two overlapping categories, behavior and activity. Starting with the first one, I tried to distinguish some general patterns of vampires' behavior. By arranging them in a sequence dictated by moral gradation, I have discovered that there is a wide behavioral range displayed by Greek vampires. The researched behavioral models were as follows: inertia, positive behavior, neutral and ambivalent behavior, trickster and delinquent behavior, and lethal behavior. I will only present here the most interesting examples. So starting with the positive behavior, it can be displayed in three different ways. In the first case, every Vrikolakas comes back to their old habits, trying to coexist within the community. In the second case, every Vrikolakas tries to start a new life in the new community. And the third case shows us a Vrikolakas that acts as a god's tool. Now, skipping to the lethal behavior, I've included their physical attacks such as beating, stoning, burning, performing sexual violence, and killing. There are many ways in which the vampires kill people. The most notable are beating to death, cutting off the air supply, tearing to shreds, throwing down from a great height, killing with voice, and causing plague. The difference between category of activity and the category of behavior is that while researching activities, I try to examine more complex issues that cannot be placed in a narrow moral category. The most interesting conclusions are connected with the time of apparition, as they are in fact 3 time cycles that vampires are submitted to: the daily cycle, the weekly cycle, and the cycle marked by liminal periods. In regards to the place of activity, I can debunk the theory that Santorini is the most infested with vampires place on Earth, which was sometimes mentioned in some Western sources. As it comes to the diet, Greek vampires were not really interested in blood. The rare examples of blood-sucking vampires in the text corpus were probably the result of contamination of Vricolakas with cinematographic or literary vampire. The sources show that Vricolakas were either omnivores, either they ate liver, entrails, or human flesh. Vricolakas were able to produce offspring with a living woman, but their children usually had some monstrous qualities, such as boneless bodies. Finishing with superpowers, the vampires in Greek folklore could get through very narrow spaces, were able to shapeshift, to become invisible, to spit fire, to mute their victim, to kill with their voice, and to swallow large objects. A Vricolakas, even the one who fits the positive behavioral model, was usually seen by Greek society in a clearly pejorative way, and because of that, one of the most important elements in folk narratives is how to neutralize the threat posed by vampires. There are many ways of doing that, including prevention, avoiding contact with a vampire, scaring it off, and of course, a total elimination of the threat. These categories tend to overlap each other. An absolute prevention is a term coined by me, which describes a means of stopping the vampirization of a body. It can be used both in a case of activities undertaken customarily during the funeral, as well as in case of individual protective actions related to someone with clear predisposition to posthumous metamorphosis. The second category belong, for example, acts of apotropaic cannibalism, which should protect people from turning into vampires after a contact with a Vricolakas. I believe that the categories of avoiding contact with vampire and scaring it off are pretty self-explanatory, so I would like to move on to the last point of my paper, which is the total elimination of the threat. This motive is usually described in great detail. From analyzed source material, I could abstract 19 different methods of vampire neutralization, as it's visible on the pie chart. The most efficient method turns out to be the total cremation of a whole body, which was, however, very hard to carry out without the special equipment, not to mention that this method was frowned upon by church officials. The characteristic Greek methods seem to be an exile to some deserted island where the Vricolakas can roam freely, not bothering anyone. The aspect of destroying Vricolakas required also to dwell on 2 related issues, namely the social groups predestined to and qualified to vampire slaying, as well as apotropaic means and symbols with their possible explanations. Nevertheless, this could be a contribution for another long discussion. I don't want to prolong my speech any further, so I will present visually the qualities of a Greek vampire. I would like you to take a look on the cloth word representing the frequency and variability of the examined issue. Finally, I want to thank you all for this conference. This is my 4th Dracula Congress and the first where I speak after my defense. You gave me the motivation, hope, and advice which guided me through my PhD research. I hope that my work could reach you at some point in the future. One of my reviewers gave me a recommendation to publish my work in English because there is a research gap in this topic. So my next goal will be trying to collect some funds for the translation process. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nina. I actually got quite moved with your thank yous at the very end. That was fantastic as always. Let's just start with congratulating you again. I did already, but I will keep doing this weekend. That was fantastic and so informative and so well presented as well. So as always, it was a pleasure to listen to you. Guys, if someone has any comments, any questions from the room or from Zoom, now is your time.
Well, let me just quickly say, Nina, that was a fabulous presentation. I always look forward to you talking. And this is the second year in a row that I've seen you talk about the Vrikolakis. So I have two questions. One, Vrikolakis, is that a specifically post-Christian vampire, or does that go back into antiquity?
No, it is specifically post-Christian vampires. So in antiquities, there were some demonic creatures that are now considered like ancestor of the vampire, like lamias and pusas and beings like that. But Vrikolakis is a clearly post-Christian concept.
Interesting. So my second and final question is, what is it about the Greek vampires that has drawn you to them to put together a whole PhD presentation?
The thing is that I am studying modern Greek philology, so I know the language, and I knew that there was a gap, and vampires were always on my mind. So I was always doing the presentations for my classes, even when I was in high school, even in the middle school. So I had knowledge of the language. I had a gap in the research because there is no English full academic work based on written about Vrikolakis, and also I just had a passion for vampires, so it is a mixture.
That's fabulous. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Also from my side, congratulations. You are so persistent in following up your interest in the Vrikolakis, and you present more and more details with every presentation. And I think it's fantastic what you're doing to go so deep into this theme. A very selfish question from my side, as I'm looking for illustration of vampire myths. During your studies, did you come across illustrations or visual representations of the Vrikolakis that were published in books or in paintings or even in modern day literature?
Unfortunately, no, but I can give another look at some works that I was using in my research. I believe that when it comes to folk tales, which I was researching, there are not many examples, but maybe in some early prints about vampires, for example, the first translation of Dracula, maybe there are some interesting illustrations. I will look into that matter.
Yeah, it would be great, because if it's such a let's say, essential element of Greek folklore, you would expect that from, let's say, the year 1700 on, when nationalism and national folklore got into the focus of many nations, that there would be illustrations that would deal with the myth. So that's all.
To be honest, in Greek folk studies, Laographia, the vampires were not really dominating topic. It was more researched by travelers, Western travelers, and only about 100 years later, the Greek people were interested in this topic themselves.
Okay. Good,
Okay.
thank you.
Any more from the room, maybe? Any comments, any questions?
Okay, so the next speaker is Adam Owsinski from Charles Darwin University in Australia. He's just starting his PhD in philosophy. He specialized in sociology, cultural studies, and also, of course, in philosophy, as I recall, especially ontology aspect. It's his second presentation on this Congress, and I will give him the mic.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name's Adam, and this is my thesis presentation as well, which I've just started. And it's called From the Page to the Mind, how the Sublime and Gothic literature works on personal identity within the otherkin community. For those who may not know, the otherkin are non-human identities. And the reason I got into this was I was doing ontology and philosophy, but my background's in disability care and social work, which is going to be a future presentation later on this afternoon. I'm going to do with Peter on a book we're writing. But in this case, this was actually a real life story that happened to me as a social worker with a family that were actually vampire otherkin. And they went to a health specialist just for a general check. And the health specialist actually deemed that the child was unfit to be in the family's care. So the child was removed. And I thought, I was this impacted by this story. I thought, hang on a minute, how does all this work? So I thought I wanted to investigate these stories. And the best way to do this was through showing the narrative in terms of how folklore, fiction, and various other aspects of narrative impact personal identity. So in my thesis, I presented these Gothic literature style paragraphs to actually impact the reader, especially those who are philosophical materialists, who had no comprehension or understanding of dualism or didn't want any understanding of dualism or saw these folk narratives as a source of dualism. So I used Jacques Derrida's form of ontology to actually present these Gothic style literature paragraphs in my thesis. And it's actually the story of writing a thesis and the journey of actually collecting your data, doing all the research. And I thought, what better way to blur this reality than blurring the reality between academic text and like creative work, basically. So then I decided, well, can we make this an internet thing as well? So all these images are used, of course, with AI. But as a part of that, we decided to do this online presentation as a part of the ontology that I was creating, so people could go in and actually explore on various different levels. So we have this character called, which I dubbed the Truth Seeker, who's actually going through this process of writing a thesis. So I'm hoping this is going to work. But I don't think the video is working.
Yeah, you don't have it.
Yeah, so the video is not. Yeah, the video is not working, unfortunately. But basically, so yeah, it was this exploration kind of game where the narrative actually takes shape and forms this mansion or this abandoned mansion, which is supposed to be a reflection of academia postmodernist. So basically, all these theories in terms of personal identity and narrative get overlooked for these more philosophical materialist points of view, where things like social construction aren't taken into consideration. So as a part of my thesis, I then had to look at how do I frame this in a form where it's acceptable for philosophical materialists to accept personal identity. So then we came up with this like style of journey of this truth seeker entering the mansion, looking for these hidden texts about this personal identity and how we basically go about presenting it to the academic world. So with all these ideas going on, I had to come up with my own theory, which I came up with refractive identities. So I looked at personal narrative and narratives in folklore and things like this and how it worked. And I looked at how light behaves inside a prism. And it's my theory that narratives perform like light, or was a form of gravity inside the brain. As someone absorbs these narratives, it can be audio, it can be visually, various different parts of stimuli enter the mind. However, how it projects on a physical person varies. And here lies the problem, trying to put otherkin identities within a philosophical materialist framework, because of course there's this consistency issue where it has to be the same from point A to point Z. However, with narrative and narrative identity, it allows for fluctuation and it allows for non-binary concepts as well. So a part of my research is I had to look at the sublime in how it was viewed by various different philosophers. And the main contrast, again, was between Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant. And we went through this whole, what is the sublime and how does it affect personal identity within the brain? Now, the reason I didn't go down the Edmund Burke route was he actually proposed the sublime to be this physical substance that you could find within not just nature itself, but within pottery or art. And of course, the philosophical materialist point of view would look at this and say, well, we break down these objects, would not find this substance that you're calling the sublime. So this is why I went down the Immanuel Kant route, and to a degree the Slavoj Žižek route, where they believe that it's a process within the mind, and it's more like a shock and awe kind of thing in terms of it impairs logic to such a degree that we can't comprehend what's happening, and it impairs our reasoning and it has this great impact upon us. So then, as a part of my research, I decided to do this phenomenological study, and well, originally I wanted to do like an observation. However, there were a few issues in terms of just doing like an observation study online. Professor Carol Cusack from Sydney University declared this behavior lurking, and it was very problematic because a lot of the ethnographers that tried to do this group in terms of the formal study didn't get permission. And yeah, it was deemed as, well, you have no actual, like, they haven't signed off on it. So there's a big ethics question. So I decided to do a more phenomenological study and do like a case study with qualitative research. So we wanted to get a group of 10 cohorts in terms of different aspects of otherkin identities. So not just vampires, but werewolves, fairies, so on and so on. And ask them a bunch of questions in terms of how they interpreted Gothic literature. And of course, there's other styles of literature at play as well. But of course, this had the potential of becoming so large, I really need to narrow the scope in what it was that I was doing. So yeah, we just focused on the Gothic literature aspect. And these were just some of the questions that we were going to ask the cohort in terms of what's your kin type, what kind of Gothic literature have you had access to, what's your favorite Gothic literature? Because if someone say they're presented as a vampire, but then their favorite story was The Hobbit, then that didn't necessarily work. So I had to account for that kind of distinction. And that's another piece of video that's not going to work. So this was the next part of the actual theory that I was coming up with, was how do I look at that distinction and that separation if they're presenting as one kin type, but they're favoring another narrative, or could there be multiple narratives at work, things like this. So the literature review was broken down into several sections. One was like the actual research questions and the case study itself, and then the actual components behind the theory. So one of the aspects that I used was narrative identity theory in McAdams, because he allowed for the breakdown of this point A to point Z to allow for like different aspects of people's lives change over time. So it can't be consistent. And not only that, the human body itself isn't consistent. Skin falls off, we replace our cells, our bone structure changes. So this whole aspect of why does our identity have to remain the same from point A to point Z really comes under question when we use narrative to look at it. Now, to appease, again, the philosophical materialists, I used one of their own, and he used a concept called the self as narrative gravity, where he looked at the self as a positional like a planet or a planetary object, and how narratives entered the brain that way and could potentially affect personal identity and how people interact with these stories. So in a nutshell, the way that I devised this theory was someone reads a text or watches a movie or listens to a song. Like I said, the medium's really irrelevant. However, it enters the brain for the temporal lobe where meaning making takes place. I'm not a psychologist, but however, this is a part of my theory that I need to get an advisor on as well, but it's my educated guess at this stage that it does happen in the temporal lobe, because that's where mean making takes place and also association takes place. So if you imagine the self as the large ball, and then there's the larger ball similar to Newton's work in gravity, the stories tends to circle around the self, and depending on certain events in the person's life, various aspects can influence why that particular narrative may have more influence than another. And of course, within identity theory, the other issue laid that there's so many different aspects and so many different approaches that I could have taken: the biological, the sociological, the psychology aspect. However, we're trying to do this hybrid theory between several different, like I said, narrative and the biological approach, mainly in order to appease philosophical materialists in how they use types and tokens as well. For those who may not be familiar, token is, we have type identities, which say if you looked at the cat, would be the cat itself, and then token would be like the subcategorization of that particular cat. One person who we looked at in particular was Peter Singer's work in animal liberation, because he looked at the aspect of how animals could be considered persons and personhood. And this is a large chunk of the research in terms of the theory that I'm looking at, and how in the 21st century do we define what a person is, especially coming from a disability background. If you simply define a person by having 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, that falls short, because what happens if someone's an amputee, or so on and so on. So there's all these various classifications of that. And again, it's the whole like continuation of the self and what is the self. I thought these were very important aspects to ask in terms of personal identity. So a large chunk of what I did was deconstruction with Jacques Derrida's work of grammatology in the Spectres and Marx text, which also looked at hauntology. And we looked at deconstructing these binaries of human and non-human, as well as concepts as good as evil, because as soon as you deconstruct these binaries, the need for a token identification kind of falls apart. And I gave some examples within that in use of deconstruction. The Rowangi River, and I apologize for my pronunciation, in New Zealand was actually classified as a person. There was a legal dispute between the Crown, the British Crown, and the New Zealand Maori on who actually owned the river. And the best solution that the 2 parties came up with was, let's give the river personhood status. That way both sides could still interact and use the river, and no one actually owned it. The more intriguing case was, I thought, the tree that owned itself. It was a tree that was from the 18th century in Alabama, Georgia, in the US. And funny enough, the tree actually fell, and a new tree came in its place called the son of the tree that owned itself. And it was given the same rights as personhood as the original tree that was there. And also, the reason I used this particular case study was, or people could say, well, vampirism is based on folk narrative, so therefore it's not a genuine form of narrative. The original person who owned this tree was a general, I forget the general's name. However, there was no lease found. There was no legal precedence or anything for this ownership of this tree. However, the local council and even the state government have continued this form of ownership over this tree. And the spectacular part about this is it just shows that personhood is really just a social concept, and it's cultural as well. So as long as the culture at large accepts that fact, you can kind of deem personhood to be anything. And this really identified the gaps in my research. So what were the gaps? And nobody really challenged the concept of identity and using the term of identity. That was a big one. The personhood concept was the other big issue I thought that needed to be addressed. And we could have easily said, well, let's just use social constructionism. However, there have been some really lazy arguments in terms of personal identity and social constructionism. So this is why I thought we needed to do something that would appease the token-based identification within personal identity, which was, I thought, narrative identity would be the best form. And this is just some information on the case study in terms of how we were going about it. As I said earlier, the amount of participants. We also wanted to prove that this just wasn't a westernized phenomenon, that this was a global thing in various different regions of the world. So we wanted to have as many different cohorts as part of the study as we could. And finally, the sampling was also another issue which we thought we could use with social media. So in terms of getting people who already identified as being other kin who had social media platforms like on YouTube or Facebook, this kind of thing, we could just approach them and ask them if they wanted to be a part of the study. And also to see what kind of text that they identified with, because there's so many Gothic literature texts, it's really impossible to pinpoint just several. However, we did try, and the comparative text that we thought we'd use in a form of triangulation with all the data that we were collecting, of course, was Dracula and Frankenstein for the themes of abandonment, which is obviously very connected in terms of otherkin. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was the third text because a lot of the werewolf type based themes popped into that. And we needed something that had very high cultural impact, that there might have been some more significant texts. However, this was very accessible and people like everywhere knew it. So these were the three that we were comparing certain tropes and characteristics with as a part of our historical ontology when we did our ontological trace. So that was basically, unfortunately, the videos aren't working, and this was the conclusion to the story of the Truth Seeker. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I hope I haven't bored you too much. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. So are there any questions or comments on the previous presentation? Okay. Nobody is raising their hand, as I can see. So I believe that we can move on to this next presentation because we're running out of time, if it's not a big deal. Okay, so the next presentation is going to be announced by Dr. Avondale from the Dr. Phil Fitzsimmons, I'm sorry, from the Avondale University in Australia. Dr. Phil Fitzsimmons works in 4L area of education, and he's a research professor who specialized in critical literacy, as far as I remember, especially in monster theory.
We'll see how this works, because I haven't done a lecture or a presentation directly for 30 years. Recently, I learned some new vocabulary. I was in the States doing a presentation, and one of the guys in the presentation said, "Oh, we're not going to get a sit and get, we're going to get a make and take." Because I work in that area of where responsibility is on the audience, you're going to do all the work today, and I hope it works. Otherwise, I'll have to do all the talking, and I can talk underwater with a mouthful of wet cement, and you don't want that. Okay, so I work in the area of monster theory, and I started in education 30 years ago, before most of you were born. I was in the States with a group of people setting up a progressive school where the whole state of the school was based on children finding their own gifts and talents and using it. Teachers weren't called teachers, they were called facilitators. And one of the classes I worked with, there was a 12-year-old girl who wrote the darkest poetry I have ever seen from anyone, let alone a 12-year-old girl. And when I asked her why, she said, "Phil, the dark side is so much more fun." And she said, "And that's where I find hope." If she'd been writing what she wrote anywhere else in the world, her parents would have been called in and the kid taken off her. It was that dark. But it was not evil. It was a way that she found herself in her poetry. When I came back to the States, when I left the States and came back to Australia, I was asked to work with a school. The kids weren't reading and weren't going to the library. And so I wandered around to have a look. And by the way, I'm a qualitative researcher. I work in the lived experience spectrum of qualitative research. I try to find out how people see themselves in the world and how they see the world. Wandering around the school, I came across a group of kids who were reading graphic novels. And at the time, I'd been working in that sort of area for a long while, and I thought I knew how to read them, but they showed me I had no idea. And so I began to really get into that lived experience of what kids read, how they read it. And what happened was that I found that these kids were reading and seeing themselves very differently, very, very differently. It does not mean that every kid sees it this way. What I've discovered is that either in the States, New Zealand, or in Australia, there are groups of kids who really engage with horror text, and I mean really engage with it. And that produces a different worldview and a different way of understanding the world. It's the dark side where you find hope, though. I often get criticised for encouraging people to read dark text or go to horror movies. But the people I work with see it very differently. This project, I nearly called it 30 under 30. It involved 30 kids. I mean, everyone's a kid to me, I'm so old. But these kids range from 18 years of age, so I could do it with ethics, minimal ethics, really. But I interviewed 30 kids from 18 to 30 years of age. I interviewed them for an hour each 3 times. And then they were allowed to ring me at home, email me with their aha experiences. And so, by the way, I don't use words like ontology or epistemology. My research students have to know what it means, but they're not allowed to use it. I focus on axiology. We don't have time to talk about all that. And so that axiology for me is where I try to understand the ideology, the values, attitudes, beliefs, translated into experiences, translated into their personal knowledge. And so that's what I did. 30 lots of interviews, 3 hours each. And then I did a 3-level analysis by hand. I don't use software to analyze qualitative data. So it takes time. I'm going to go, I can't show you all the quotes. I can't give you all the findings. We just don't have time. But have a look at this. Let's see if this works. Oh, by the way, grounded theory, if I'm telling you how to suck eggs, I apologize. The grounded theory is where theory is derived from letting the respondents speak. I step out of the way. It's the meeting of emic and etic knowledge, my knowledge, their knowledge, and I just withdraw to the point where much of this has been written up, but I withdrew, allowing the kids to actually help me shape the text. So you're not going to see, one of them said, Phil, when they found out I was coming here, they said, Phil, keep it simple. The KISS rule, keep it simple for stupid, and I'm stupid. So you're not going to see highfalutin words, but you're going to see something that took a long time to discuss and talk about. But I'm going to ask you, because I work in that project-based learning area and have done for 30 years, I'm going to show you some text, and I want you to tell me what you see. In this room, we have the equivalent of several genii or geniuses. I really don't know what the plural is. So let's see how this goes. I'll flick through the Dracula stuff. This kid it's a female, age 24 years. I'll read it to you in case you can't see it. The things that stand for the vampire look solid, but they're mostly hollow. That was one finding that came through very clearly, this notion that the vampire and everything to do with vampire films in particular was about containership. Now, we live in a world where we use metaphor all the time. It's not poetic metaphor. We can't live without metaphor. I mean, the classic example I always use when I talk about this is that I'm feeling down. It's an embodied directionality of our language. And these kids, this is the first thing I noticed. Not all, but the majority, certainly all touched on it, saw the vampire not as blood and bite. They'd even moved beyond the fright. They admitted that very early on they did this. But gradually they began to see something else. And it wasn't metaphor per se, it was they were metonymic. In other words, everything was connected, every vampire movie was connected. And they were learning something new about the vampire each time, which in turn, they were learning about themselves, they claimed. So what do you think it means? This notion of the vampire as containership. And they actually said, that's why I've used the word materiality. They gave qualifiers, it's brooding, force, control, and death. But what do you think they mean? Guess what's in their head? Very bad teaching and lecturing, but what do you think it means if they saw the vampire and everything to do with the vampire? I noticed in the last presentation, there was a coffin. That's the classic containership. What do you think they mean? What do you think is going on? Have a guess. Don't all speak at once, just take your time. Absolutely. For them, containership was control, absolute control. And that they were able to break the bonds of their habitus, for example, the constraints of family, the constraints of the family narrative, the constraints of the meta-narrative where they went to school, the constraints of the meta-narrative where they lived. They saw the vampire as providing an opportunity to think and reflect on that. That's what the vampire was for them, a reflective tool, or I should say reflexive. Because these kids just didn't think and move on, they thought in circles. And one thing that I was really, and it shouldn't have surprised me, is that this group in particular formed clumps, reflective clumps. In other words, that's how I found them. I found the first person. I'm a coffee addict and I support my caffeine dealer really well every 2 or 3 times a day. And the barista who served me was asking me what I was doing, and I found out she was a horror freak. Just loved it. She introduced me to her brother. They introduced me to their cousins. And that's how the 30 came about, from meeting 5 or 6 different people and finding these clumps. But those clumps talk to each other almost daily about the horror films that they saw and the horror films that they wanted to see. I went to the movies with my barista friend and her brother, and I stood back because people coming out, they would talk immediately after the movie and talk about what they saw. And it wasn't just retell, it was, what did you see? And that's what these kids did. They wanted to know about themselves by looking at cinema. I've recently, well, in 2019, before COVID broke loose, I was working in the States, and I started to, a survey was done on what kids were doing, reading and writing and listening, speaking, etc., what they were looking at. And the conclusion of the research, which was national research, was that with the streaming capabilities nowadays, film had now become, again, the raison d'etre for kids under 25. That's where, I mean, for example, a friend of mine in the US is writing a book about love. And he believes that most kids in America under 25 get their idea and ideals of love from the cinema, rightly or wrongly. There are major issues, but that's what's going on. The cinema is vitally important to young kids under 25. Vital. But I don't know what happens with you in school. In school, they can't talk about that. Cinema studies is not a critical part of Australian school system, and it should be, especially when you have kids under 30 constantly talking to each other and watching horror. The other day, I mean, I've lost track of the days. I was asked today what I'm doing tomorrow, and I don't know. I can't remember what I had for breakfast. I'm so tired. But that's the whole notion of the monster. The monster has always been an element which puts forward and proposes a critical issue in society. That's what these kids look for. And even though I said I was going to get you to do all the work, I'm doing all the rambling, I apologize. But once the monster is named, it can no longer exist. That's its semiotic nature. It can't exist with itself in society because it lives only to point forward to the fissures and fractures in the world. Once named and framed, it disappears, but will always return, according to Cohen, and it always does. If we live in a world of monstrosity, as Cohen said in 1999, what is the world like now? We are inundated with horror movies, especially about the vampire. There is a psychosocial reason for that the world is full of fractures and fissures, and the vampire only lives is a revenant to show that we don't learn very much as a race, and we move extremely slowly in our existential wondering and wandering. For me, the vampire is a spiritual element. It doesn't mean religious. We are human beings on a spiritual path, almost spiritual beings on a human path, and the vampire comes in wherever there is an issue to show us. In fact, the word monster in Latin, and I'm hopeless at pronunciation, means to teach. That's its basic meaning. And so the vampire is the monster par excellence, to show us. And this is what these kids were getting at. They wanted to know if they could break the bonds of the world they lived in. And the vampire was one way of doing it. One way. This does not apply for all kids. It applies to kids who are engaged in that socio-cultural wandering and find others who want to talk about it. I've been wondering about this, but recently a friend of mine and I were contracted to do a study of spirituality in the world's largest Protestant system in Australia. And we visited schools high and low. And what we found was that most of the kids in the school weren't Christian. Parents sent them there for a whole lot of different reasons. What we found was what was going on, that there were these kids talking as well. We suspect it's because of the net. Kids are more connected than ever, but they're wanting to know stuff, and so they talk to each other. That's happening as a hidden curriculum. Same as the monster is operating as a hidden curriculum in our society. That was a bit of a ramble. 19 years of age, a young guy, just left school. They saw he saw his direct. By the way, I've used these quotes as representative of what all the kids had to say. Different forms, same linguistic thing. Remember, it's an encapsulation. By the way, you need to tell me when my 20 minutes are up because I'll just keep on rambling and rambling. Okay. And so in Dracula films, you need to see everything as a driving force, a sense of direction. There's another metaphor. We live in a world of directionality. As I said before, we either feel down or things are looking up. We use that language all the time. They saw that happening metonymically in every Dracula film. It's a driving force. It keeps on moving. It's about darkness and dissolution. But what these kids taught me was that they read cinema not left to right, left to right directionality as we read, but circular. And they can invert things. What you see on the flick does not really mean what's going on. You can invert it. And that's what their discussions are all about. What happens if the meaning was really this? What happens if you transposed it into this? And so the darkness was a lot of fun. I mean, these guys just loved it. But it also showed them possibility. It showed them that parameters could be broken. Have I still got time to keep rambling? Okay. The one thing that I also learned from these kids was that they saw cinema as being whole. The little things, the lacunae that popped into their mind, they had to recirculate back into what was really going on. They showed me all sorts of things. I mean, I didn't let on, I let them do all the talking. The whole notion of the lacunae of the clock in Dracula, the lacunae of the mirror. Mirror is only mentioned once in Dracula, and yet it's become this trope all the way through. But they saw it as a materiality, an inversion process. The first thing that Harker does, as from memory, tired memory, is that he tries to go to the mirror to comb his hair. But that mirror is a trope for what you see, what you don't see. The reflective process. I didn't put this in, and perhaps I should have, but they thought that the whole notion of Dracula not being able to see himself in a mirror was not because he didn't have a soul, because he didn't want to see himself. They saw Dracula as representative of the fear that is every one of us of what we all could become, and we just don't want to know it. That's the direction that the directional force that they saw in every Dracula movie. I mean, I think I'll get to a quote where they actually agreed that a lot of what goes on in Dracula is this total facade, and you have to look behind the mirror. You have to look behind to see what Dracula thinks he sees. They actually said when you're watching Dracula movies, you have to have your whole senses turned on. They're all related. The smallest element. They talked about the movie coming up, The Dementor. And they talked about how there it is, there's the container, the force that is driven by Dracula, that ends up wrecked. And they talked about, well, what does that really mean? They talked about themselves as being driven by all the things that shouldn't be driving them. They talked about control. And I mean, one of the most famous quotes that I lived my professional life by is by Postman Weingartner, who said that everyone should have inbuilt crap detectors turned on. And if it's crap, you don't have anything to do with it. This is what these kids were doing. They had inbuilt crap detectors. And yes, they had to live their world in a social existence. They weren't total rebels, but they were looking for ways and means to find out who they were. And it wasn't just a mirror image as per Stoker. By the way, a lot of the discussion went back to Stoker and what he was really doing in writing this. 6 of these 30 had actually done higher degrees in creative writing and film studies. And we were going off on all these tangents. But one thing that they came up with was, why did Stoker actually write Dracula? And we talked a lot about, well, he spent the first 6 years, we think, as basically an invalid. But at 6, we believe he began to walk. Now, 6 is a critical age for a kid. In my world, at 6 years of age, that's where a kid actually starts to have adult conversations, can think critically, can understand subliminal messages. And Stoker had been lying in bed listening to the stories told by his mother of the disease epidemics in Ireland. And yes, that was a source possibly of Dracula, but it was more a source of what was going on in Stoker's head as a 6-year-old kid not being able to walk. listening to all the things that went into the house, looking out the window and seeing the world go by, directionality, and he had none. He spent I'm going off on a tangent now too, and I'll stop. We talked about how he spent 6 years writing that book. To be engaged for 6 years to write a narrative, you bring in a lot of your own habitus, you bring in a lot of your own constructs of culture, your context of situation, and that's what Stoker did. And they saw all that in Dracula films, but that was a reflective process of where they were at, their sense of purpose, their sense of habitus. It was a critique of their context of situation and context of culture. I apologize that there's so much text, and I hope you can read it. They saw Dracula and horror in general as a social, emotional force. As I said, fears and anxieties, but in their world, you could not trust anything except your initial social, emotional reaction. Truth was based on how you initially felt, and through discussion became translated into what was the emotional context of what they were watching? How did it relate to their context? Constant reflection or reflexivity back to Stoker's book, back to what was really going on. They saw the first chapters of Stoker, of Harker riding in the carriage to Transylvania, and what that really meant, what was really going on. They saw that in themselves. They also saw that there was more to the blood and the bite and sex. There was something else going on about deconstruction of the body, deconstruction of the self, deconstruction of that containership. I might stop there. Yep.
Okay, so thank you very much. I want to say that for me personally, the idea of hollow vampire was really interesting, because even in folklore studies, we have some vampires that are cut open and they can show that they are empty. So I think it's really symbolic. So anyone wants to make a comment or ask something?
I just wanted to say, yeah, totally agree with what you were saying in terms of breaking down the deconstruction in terms of the self. But I think also too is important to stress it, like it presents a form of freedom of expression.
Yes.
And I think, especially in the Australian education system in particular, I think this is an area that needs drastic addressing. So yeah, congratulations on that. I think it's fantastic.
Okay.
What do you want me to say?
To comment.
Look, I think every teacher should be a radicalizer of their kids. And what I mean by that is critical thinking. And I'm going to be really negative now, is that we live in a right-wing world in Australia, and the government does not want critical thinking. Exactly the opposite. We train our teachers to have a fourfold approach to teaching literature, one of which is text analyst. We no longer are able to do that, which I find really interesting. It's very robotic, yeah. Anything else?
I just wanted to congratulate you on this survey and ask for the reason behind the thoughts about doing that in the first place, because I found it absolutely fascinating that you've asked these questions and people were they your students, first of all, or were they just people from the street that you were talking to?
My experience is that even little kids, they may be small, but their brains are not. And that I do a lot of work with 6-year-olds even before they go to school, for example. And I find that little kids, all kids, have a great deal of intrinsic ethic knowledge that is never tapped into. And I'm just lucky enough to find kids who want to talk to me. The problem, it's not a problem actually. The thing is that I'm always amazed at what they will tell me and how much they will tell me. They just never get asked. And so I'm really lucky to be able to do that. That's it. And I just wander through the world finding people who are willing to talk to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that answer.